Hello everybody out there, it's Timothy here. I finally got some time to go ahead and put together a video series for Modern Masters 2017 looking specifically at the draft archetypes. Now, normally when a set comes out, I would review the individual cards one by one and kind of give them a point rating as I did with Ether Revolt, but keep in mind Modern Masters is made completely out of reprint, so people kind of have an understanding of how the cards work already, how they'll interact with each other. So I thought it'd be better to kind of look at archetypes the same way I did when Eternal Masters came out. The master sets in general are usually built with archetypes in mind, which means that if you're able to put together a specific strategy the way it was intended to be drafted, you'll end up with a more consistently winning deck than if you just draft a pile of random good cards that all share a color. So with that being said, we're looking at 5 different archetypes, so we'll have 5 different videos, and each archetype will focus on one of the shards that we see here. The set is designed in shards. That means 3 color combinations based on the Shards of Alara combinations of colors. And we'll start with the Bant shard. But the interesting thing about Modern Masters 2017 is that the real focus is on 2 color pairs within that particular shard. So while we're talking about Bant here, which is blue, white, and green, we won't actually see a lot of green cards in this video. The main archetype is blue, white, but the support is really Bant altogether. So with that being said, each of these videos will follow a certain pace, kind of showing you what cards you should be focused on when you go to your first drafts, and how you should be approaching the format if you're looking to build a synergistic archetypal deck. So let's jump right in with Bant here. And one thing I'm going to mention at the beginning of each of these videos are shard-specific picks. There are very few of these. That is, these are the cards that require all 3 colors in order for you to cast them. There's 1 rare and I believe 1 uncommon in each color combination for the shards, and then there's 1 mana fixer or a tri-land that comes in tapped and provides all 3 colors. For Bant, we're looking at Rock's Warmonk as our uncommon here. Just a exceptionally solid 3-drop. I should mention in this video, and I may mention it in the others, that mana fixing is very, very plentiful in this set, so being able to pull off a turn 3 color creature seems actually very doable. If you harken back to Khans of Tarkir, which was also a 3 color set with very similar mana fixing, there were very often turns where you could just play a 3 color creature on turn 3 if you had it, due to the abundance of mana fixing. But back to Rock's Warmonk, this card is great. As with the rest of the shards, we'll see that these uncommons are a real big push to move into the color, which is why I'm mentioning them, despite there being very few of them. Rock's Warmonk just attacks and blocks very, very well, has a really high toughness point for its mana cost, and can swing a game in your favor. The rare one that most people aren't going to be excited to pull, but is still a very solid card, is Stoic Angel. The Bant Angel here is 4 mana for a 3/4 flyer with Vigilance, and stops players from untapping more than 1 creature per turn. If you're able to tap your opponent's creatures down, this can get really out of hand, but on stats alone, as well as keywords, this card is pretty solid. Not a busted rare by any means, it's a perfectly fair card, but a pretty strong pick, and again, an incentive to move into Bant if you see that it's being passed around. The land here is Seaside Citadel. Not much to say about it, but I did think it was worth mentioning the tri-land in each colors. If you end up in Bant, Seaside Citadel is your best mana fixer, and you should be happy to pick it up. For these videos, I'll also be mentioning what you should be prioritizing when you see that you're going to be moving into this archetype. Or rather, another way to put this is, when do you know this archetype is open? If you start seeing the cards on this list coming around to you really late, and quite a few of them coming around late, it's probably a sign that the archetype is open and is your cue to move in on the archetype. There are certain archetypes, as with this one, where you want to prioritize multiple things, which I will mention here. The first thing you want to prioritize, and the thing that makes this the blue-white blink deck, is of course the blink effects. We have cards like Vanish into Memory, Momentary Blink, and Ghostly Flicker. These are kind of your bread and butter cards that put you into this archetype. These cards do something in other decks that don't really want you to be a blink deck. In other words, they can save your creatures or rebuy into the battlefield triggers, but that's really where we want to be abusing it in this deck. Momentary Blink and Ghostly Flicker especially let you get a ton of value off of creatures with very good ETB effects. Vanish into Memory is a little bit wonkier when it comes to how it functions, but it's still the type of card you'd be happy to play in this deck. I actually think Ghostly Flicker and Momentary Blink, while not being exceptionally high picks themselves, are a very clear sign that you can draft a Blink deck, and that if you have the creatures to support it, the deck is probably open. Other Blink effects include Graceful Reprieve, which is a very weird one. It's not necessarily Blink, but lets you reuse an Enter the Battlefield trigger. I have never played with this card, and it has a little bit of a setup cost. It's not the ideal card to use here. You would rather have Momentary Blink or Ghostly Flicker if you're in this deck, but I think it has some usefulness, and I wanted to mention it because it has some real applications in this deck. We also have Mist Meadow Witch, it's a fun one to say, Flicker Wisp, which is probably just the ideal card for the situation, Core Skyfisher, and then cards like Deputy of Acquittals. Now, Mist Meadow Witch and Flicker Wisp are the type of cards that you really want in the deck. High priority creatures which add a sort of clock and a sort of a pressure to your opponent while also giving you the same sort of effects you want. Flicker Wisp is just an amazing card all the way around, and it's probably one of the if not the single best non-rare card you can get for this sort of deck. Flicker Wisp comes down as a 3-power flyer that also lets you blink a permanent and has a little bit of extra flexibility in blinking your opponent's creatures, as does Mist Meadow Witch. Since Mist Meadow actually used to be a rare, that kind of harkens to how powerful its effect is. Being able to get these creatures in your deck and reuse Enter the Battlefield triggers multiple times is quite good. With Core Skyfisher and Deputy of Acquittals, it's not necessarily blinking as much as it is taking a turn off to reuse your creatures, but their effects are flexible enough in this deck that you want cards like this. Not to mention, Core Skyfisher is just a really solid card for its mana cost. In addition to the blink effect, you also just want the ETB effect. If you don't have the inter-battlefield triggers to make this deck work, you are not a blue-white blink deck. Blinking creatures doesn't really do that much if you're not getting extra value off doing so. We're talking about cards here like Mist Raven and Core Hookmaster, which tend to be very disruptive and good tempo plays. Being able to rebuy these off of Momentary Blink and cards of that nature really gives you an edge above your opponent, especially if you're a tempo deck that's able to be attacking. If you're really drawing out the long game, these effects go down in value, but if you're able to attack for even small incremental amounts of damage over the course of the game, having re-access to these abilities and being able to repeat it turn after turn with your blink effects can get you a very large edge against your opponent. We also have things like Coiling Oracle, Seagate Oracle, Augur of Bolus, Urbis Protector, and we could go on and on with the Splicers, cards like Attendant Knight. You see here that you have just tons of value, and if you look at these ETB triggers, there are kind of two different directions you can take it. With cards like Coiling Oracle, Seagate Oracle, and Augur of Bolus, you're really trying to get extra value out of card draw and card selection. You're trying to improve your hand and make sure you always have a steady access to cards and specific types of effects in order to keep your value train rolling. The other hand, you can play cards like Urbis Protector and the Splicers, even cards like Attendant Knight, and kind of go for a beatdown strategy where you're constantly making more creatures. There are a lot of Splicers in this set, and they're all geared towards the Bant Shard, including one green slicer and I believe one blue slicer, in addition to quite a few white ones, which kind of shows what they were intending here. They want you to be able to reuse your Enter the Battlefield triggers and go for a little army of creatures while also getting value out of cards like your Mist Raven and Core Hookmaster. So make an army, attack with them, use your disruptive abilities to get tempo out of your opponent, and then use your card draw abilities to make sure that you always have access to certain effects to be able to keep this train going. Now, the key rares here, this is my favorite part. This is where you open a rare and you know that you want to go this strategy because the rare just says it. The one that really stands out to me here is Deadeye Navigator. This card is absurdly powerful. Even in limited, it's just insanely strong. If you play it on turn 6 and your opponent doesn't kill it, you should be able to win. But its ability to reuse Enter the Battlefield triggers over and over again, as well as being able to re-soul bond with other creatures and use their Enter Battlefield triggers, really just wins you the game on its own. Not to mention, it's a really beefy body for a blue card. A 5/5 seems pretty strong in this format, with a lot of creatures capping out at 3 and 4 power. So Deadeye Navigator is Probably nothing short of a bomb rare. We also have Restoration Angel. Excuse the foreign language here. For those of you who don't know, it has Flash and Fly-In, and when it enters the battlefield, you can blink another non-angel creature you control instantaneously, so it does come onto the battlefield right away. Just a solid body altogether on a flyer, with Flash giving it extra instant speed flexibility, as well as the same Flicker Wisp type ability in order of being able to reuse and enter the battlefield effect. I really like Flicker Wisp. It's similar to a strong creature version of Momentary Blink or Ghostly Flicker, where you can do it at instant speed to save a creature while also getting the blink value off of the enter the battlefield trigger. We have Venser, Shaper Savant, and cards like Seance here to be able to reuse our own effects. Seance requires a little bit of a setup cost, and while I've never played with the card, it seems like it has a home in this kind of deck. Venser is very disruptive and fits into a lot of strategies. Basically, if you're playing blue, you're happy to play Venser. Same goes for cards like Deadeye Navigator and Restoration Angel. They are bomb enough that you would play them in pretty much any deck, but they really shine in this deck, which is why I'm putting them here in the key rares, and you may not see them in other videos, despite them still being strong cards in other archetypes. Venser most of the time will be used as a tempo play to soft counter an opponent's spell while also adding power to the board, but there are rare occasions where you can use Venser to bounce your own creature back to your hand and then replay it to perhaps draw a card if you have an Oracle or something along those lines. Other effects include Aether Mage's Touch, which I'm not a fan of. I think you should stay away from this card since it can miss and requires a little bit of setup and a little bit of luck. I think this card is quite bad, and being a rare is a little disappointing, but it is still a card that fits in this archetype, and the type of card you'll probably be able to get pretty late. We have Thragtusk here, which is the only green rare I believe that's going to be on this list. Thragtusk is insanely strong, insanely valuable as it is. Being able to blink this card wins you the game on its own. Being able to do that repetitively is very strong. Notice, for those of you who've never played against or with Thragtusk, that Thragtusk triggers and gives you a 3/3 anytime it leaves the battlefield, not just when it dies. So being able to blink it perhaps multiple times means you're getting extra creatures, and every time it comes back in, you gain extra life. Thragtusk and Restoration Angel was a huge combo when they were in Standard together, and they're back to wreak havoc on Modern Masters 2017. The next card on this list doesn't actually belong in this video. It was more of a clerical error, but Ranger of Eos perhaps has a place in this archetype if you have a bunch of one converted mana cost creatures, but that was my mistake on believing that Ranger of Eos actually fetches one power creatures. It does not. Ranger of Eos belongs in a different archetype unless you're just full of one mana cost creatures, but you know, that was my mistake there. The other card I wanted to talk about here is Blade Splicer. As I already mentioned, all of the splicers are great in this archetype, some being stronger than others, Blade Splicer being the strongest of all. Blade Splicer is essentially a 4/4 for 3 mana spread out on 2 bodies, 3 of which has First Strike, and if I need to explain why that's good, you should probably learn a little bit more about Limited. In Limited, Blade Splicer is a house. It's a very good card. It works in conjunction with other splicers exceptionally well, and while it's a little bit fragile, that's why you're playing this archetype. Your fragile creatures give you a little bit of extra value. Being able to blink Blade Splicer, especially at instant speed as a way to save it, seems like a game-winning strategy. Blade Splicer is most certainly a first pickable card out of nearly any pack. It's just got the raw power level of a above curve creature with a very evasive combat relevant ability. With that being said, one thing I wanted to add to these videos that I never did with my Eternal Masters videos was I wanted to mention how to beat the archetype. So it's one thing to know how to draft the archetype and what belongs in it, and sometimes there are some archetypes that are just super strong and limited, and they become the quote-unquote best archetype of the draft or something along those lines. What I wanted to mention is how do you beat this? What kind of deck has a very good matchup against it? And what I came up with is if you are a fast, aggressive deck, or you're able to produce really large creatures, you should be able to outpace your opponent. Keep in mind the Bant shard here requires a lot of really small creatures to be going wide, and a lot of very frail early drop creatures that don't really perform well in combat. Rather, Bant or the blue-white blink deck needs to outvalue its opponent, and it can't do that if it's under so much pressure that it has to be blocking with its creatures constantly. These are just random examples, but if you look through the set, there are quite a few ways to push in very large creatures. both with flying and without. If you go back a couple slides, if you ignore the rares for the most part, the vast majority of the blue-white blink deck is made up of very small creatures that cap out at about 3 toughness. Playing a 4-power creature just smashes through. It doesn't matter whether it's in the air or on the ground. And if your opponent's forced to be blocking with their creatures, then they're not going to be able to rebuy the abilities and get the activations over and over, which is what the deck wants to be doing. So if you find that your opponent is playing this blue-white deck and they're outvaluing you and you're having trouble keeping pace, then my suggestion is see if you can lower your curve and put in some hyper-aggressive early-game creatures. Woolly Thokdar being like leader of the pack here, but even a random 4-power creature like Ogre Jailer should be enough to push through most things. And if you're able to keep up a threat base that your opponent can't actively deal with on a turn-to-turn basis, you should be able to crush your opponent in no time. It is worth noting that Bant just also has a decent decent draw against these sort of decks with cards like Mistraven. If you're spending a lot of mana on your haymakers and you're tapping out turn after turn and your opponent's able to get an edge on you and bounce it back turn after turn and you just can't keep a board presence, you're going to fall behind exceptionally quickly. So you need to get on board fast. You need to be able to make sure you're attacking, and it sounds really silly, but winning the die roll really helps with that. That's not very good advice when it comes to Magic, but it does kind of give you an edge. Winning the die roll and being able to start smashing your opponent before they can really set up their combos is pretty nice here. And then finally, wanted to thank you guys for watching with some really horrific font on the screen. Next up, I'll be talking about the Grixis Shard, which, despite being red, blue, black, is focused on the red-black Unearth archetype, which is pretty sweet. It's essentially just a aggro reanimator style deck, but that's for next time. Anyway, I appreciate you guys watching. I hope this was helpful in some way, shape, or form, and I hope this can kind of give you an idea of how to approach the Bant color, or at least the blue-white blink deck from Modern Masters. I think this deck looks super sweet, and I think it's very well supportive, both in its creatures and its spells. So I'm looking forward to drafting it. I'm a huge fan of these styles of decks in Limited, where you can just get exceptional value and get so far ahead on cards and card advantage and board presence that your opponent just can't keep up. So we'll see what it ends up being at, or how well it ends up playing, but it looks exciting. And again, tune in next time where I will be talking about the Unearthed deck, which also has a lot of really cool things going for it. Yep, my name's Timothy. I appreciate you guys watching, and I will see you next time.